He thought his last words would disappear in the dark, but someone was listening. The air of the lower level of Kang Ji-hyun's estate always felt colder than the rest of the house, as if the marble above absorbed warmth and left nothing but silence behind. Amelia Carter noticed it on her first night, the way the quiet pressed against her ears while she carried a tray of untouched tea down a corridor no staff ever lingered in, her footsteps soft against polished concrete, her presence expected to be invisible, unremarkable, forgotten. She had learned quickly that in this house, invisibility was survival, especially for someone like her, a black maid from Brooklyn now standing in the heart of Seoul, where power moved in whispers and eye contact could feel like a challenge. The door at the end of the hallway was slightly open, just enough for a voice to slip through, low and steady, not desperate, not loud, but weighted with something final. Amelia paused without meaning to, her hand tightening around the tray as the voice spoke again. If anyone hears this, tell his son I kept my promise. And for a moment, the world seemed to narrow to that single sentence, hanging in the air like it wasn't meant to be lost. She shouldn't have listened. Every rule she had been given was clear. Don't stop, don't question, don't involve yourself. But something in the tone stopped her, not fear, not anger, but a quiet certainty, the kind that didn't belong in a place built on control. She glanced down the corridor. Empty, the house above humming faintly with distant life. And then back to the door, her reflection faint in the steel handle, her dark skin catching the dim light in contrast to the pale walls around her, a reminder of how out of place she was and how easily she could be erased. Inside, the man spoke again, softer now. He deserves to know the truth. And Amelia felt something shift in her chest, subtle but undeniable, like a memory she didn't own pressing against her conscience. She had come to this job for one reason, to work, to send money home, to stay unnoticed. But this wasn't just another sound to ignore. This was a message meant for someone who would never hear it unless she carried it forward. Footsteps echoed faintly from above, distant but enough to snap her back, and she moved again, forcing herself forward, past the door, past the voice, her breathing steady but her mind no longer quiet. Upstairs, the estate returned to its polished perfection, chandeliers glowing, voices measured, everything in its place, including Kang Ji-hyun, seated at the head of a long table, his presence commanding even in stillness, his white skin illuminated by soft golden light, his expression unreadable as men around him spoke in careful tones. Amelia kept her eyes down as she set the tray, just another servant completing a task. But the words echoed louder now, cutting through the silence she was meant to maintain, and for the first time since she arrived, invisibility felt heavier than risk. She stepped back into the shadows where she belonged, her hands steady, her posture controlled, but her thoughts refusing to settle, because somewhere beneath the marble and power and quiet obedience, a man was waiting for his last words to mean something. And without knowing why, Amelia Carter had already decided they would. The house never truly slept, but it knew how to pretend, and that night, as Amelia Carter moved through the upper halls with a fresh set of linens folded neatly in her arms, everything felt too quiet, too controlled, like a stage waiting for a line that had not yet been delivered. She passed by polished glass walls reflecting a version of herself that did not belong there, her dark skin contrasting against the pale marble and gold accents, her presence reduced to movement without identity. Exactly how they preferred it. Downstairs, behind a door she was never meant to acknowledge, a man had spoken words that did not fit into this world, and no matter how carefully she tried to push them aside, they followed her, repeating with a quiet persistence, "Tell his son I kept my promise," as if they had chosen her specifically. Amelia reached the laundry room and set the linens down, her fingers lingering on the fabric longer than necessary, her mind drifting back to the tone of that voice, steady and calm, not like someone bargaining or begging, but like someone who had already accepted the outcome and only wanted the truth to survive. She had heard fear before in different places, different lives, but this had not been fear, and that difference unsettled her more than anything else. The door behind her opened without warning, and she turned slightly as Mrs. Han, the head housekeeper, stepped inside with her usual composed expression, her posture straight, her voice measured. "You are late with the evening rotation," she said, not harsh, but firm enough to remind Amelia of her place. Amelia nodded quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I will finish it now," keeping her tone even, careful, respectful. But Mrs. Han's eyes lingered on her a second longer than usual, as if sensing something. "Unspoken. In this house," she added quietly, "we do not pause where we are not assigned." And with that, she turned and left, the message clear without needing explanation. Amelia exhaled slowly once the door closed, her chest tightening as the weight of those words settled in. Because she had paused, she had listened, and now she could not undo it. The rest of the night unfolded in precise routine. Trays collected, rooms reset, lights dimmed at exact intervals. Every action performed with the kind of efficiency that erased individuality. But beneath that rhythm, Amelia's thoughts refused to quiet, each task accompanied by the same question she could not silence. Why would a prisoner speak of the boss's son? And why did it sound like a promise that mattered? Near midnight, she found herself back in the corridor that led downstairs, her steps slower this time. Not accidental, not unaware, but deliberate in a way that made her pulse quicken. The air shifted as she approached, cooler, heavier, the silence deeper than anywhere else in the estate. And for a moment she stood at the top of the stairs, her hand resting lightly against the railing, knowing that one more step would mean crossing a line she had been warned never to cross. She told herself to turn back, to finish her shift, to forget what she had heard, but the memory of that steady voice held her in place, not demanding, not desperate, just present, waiting. And in that quiet space between fear and decision, Amelia, Carter realized something she had not expected when she first walked into this house, that sometimes the most dangerous thing was not breaking a rule, but pretending you had not heard the truth when it was placed right in front of you. Amelia Carter did not move for a long time, her hand still resting against the cool railing as the silence below seemed to breathe slowly, almost alive, and somewhere deep in that stillness, she realized that what held her in place was not fear of punishment, but the weight of something unfinished, something that had quietly been handed to her without permission. The estate above continued its quiet rhythm. Distant footsteps, the faint hum of climate control, the soft closing of doors, all reminders that life here operated on precision and control, but none of it reached this lower level, where the air felt heavier and time moved differently. She took one step down, then another, each movement measured, each breath controlled, her senses sharpening as the corridor came into view again, the same door slightly open, the same sliver of dim light cutting across the floor. This time, there was no voice, only silence. But it was not empty. It carried the echo of what had already been said, and somehow that made it more present. Amelia paused just outside the doorway, her eyes adjusting, her mind racing through every warning she had been given since arriving in this house. Every rule designed to keep people like her from becoming involved in things that did not belong to them. She knew she should leave, that whatever existed beyond that threshold was not her responsibility. But the words returned again, steady, undeniable. "Tell his son I kept my promise." And she could not ignore the way they felt less like a request and more like a truth that refused to disappear. Slowly, she shifted her weight forward, just enough to see inside, careful not to cross fully into the room, careful to remain at the edge where she could still pretend she had not gone too far. The man sat in a chair positioned near the far wall, his posture upright despite the circumstances, his presence calm in a way that did not match the setting. And when his eyes lifted, they met hers without surprise, as if he had been expecting someone. If not her specifically, then someone willing to listen. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and Amelia felt the space between them stretch, filled with questions she did not know how to ask. "You heard me," he said finally, his voice low but steady, not accusing, not urgent, simply stating what was already clear. Amelia hesitated, her instincts pulling her in two directions, one toward silence. the other toward acknowledgement, and before she could stop herself, she nodded, just once, a small movement that carried more consequence than she wanted to admit. The man studied her briefly, his expression unreadable but not unkind. And then he spoke again, "Then you understand why it matters." And something in his tone made it clear that he was not asking for sympathy or help in the usual sense. He was placing trust in a place where trust did not belong. Amelia's throat tightened slightly, her voice quiet when it came. "Why me?" she asked, not out of defiance but genuine confusion, because she was no one here, just a worker meant to pass through spaces unnoticed. The man's gaze did not waver. "Because you stopped," he replied, as if that alone explained everything, as if the simple act of listening had already set her apart from everyone else in this house. Amelia felt that answer settle into her chest, heavier than she expected, because it meant there was no distance left between her and what she had heard, no way to pretend she had remained outside of it. Behind her, somewhere above, a door closed with a soft but distinct sound, a reminder that the world she belonged to was still waiting, still moving, still expecting her to return and continue as if nothing had changed. But standing there at the edge of a line she had already crossed, Amelia Carter understood that something had changed, quietly, completely. And there was no longer a version of this night, where she simply walked away without carrying those words with her. Amelia Carter felt the weight of his answer settle deeper than she expected, because it was not complicated or dramatic. It was simple and undeniable. She had stopped, and in a place where everyone was trained to keep moving, that alone had changed everything. The man's gaze remained steady, not pleading, not demanding, but certain in a way that made silence feel like a decision rather than an absence of words. And for a moment Amelia did not know what to say, because no one had ever placed responsibility on her like this before. Not in a house where she was meant to pass through rooms like a shadow. She glanced briefly over her shoulder, the corridor behind her still empty, the faint light above casting long reflections across the floor, and when she looked back at him, something in her expression had shifted, less hesitation, more awareness of what this moment required. "What promise?" she asked quietly, her voice careful but no longer distant, and the man exhaled slowly as if he had been waiting for that question, not because he needed to explain, but because he needed someone to carry the truth. "Years ago," he began, his tone even, almost reflective, "there was a day your boss could not control everything, a moment, where power did not matter as much as timing." And Amelia listened, her focus narrowing as each word seemed to place another piece into a story she had never been meant to hear. His son, the man continued, was somewhere he should not have been, somewhere no one was watching closely enough, and for a few minutes, everything that protects a family like his disappeared. Amelia felt her breath slow, her mind instinctively picturing the contrast between the guarded estate above and the vulnerability being described, something that did not fit with the image of absolute control Kang Ji-hyun carried. "I was there," the man said simply, and that was the first moment his voice carried something deeper, not regret, not pride, but a quiet acknowledgement of something that had already been decided long ago. Amelia's fingers tightened slightly at her sides, her attention locked on him now, because the pieces were beginning to align in a way she could not ignore. "I did what needed to be done," he added, not elaborating, not dramatizing, just stating a fact that did not require decoration. "And before I left, I told him something." He paused then, just briefly, as if choosing the exact words mattered more than anything else. "I told him I would always keep him safe, even if I was not there." The silence that followed felt heavier than anything that had come before. And Amelia understood then that this was not just a story. It was a connection that had been erased somewhere along the way. "He does not know," the man said, his eyes steady on hers. "And maybe he never will, but a promise does not disappear just because it is forgotten." Amelia felt something shift again, stronger this time, because the meaning behind the words was no longer abstract. It was direct. It was tied to the boy upstairs, the same boy whose life was structured by security and control, unaware of something that had once existed outside of it. "Why are you here then?" she asked, her voice softer now. Not challenging, but searching, and the man gave a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that carried no humor but a quiet acceptance. "Because not all truths are convenient," he replied, and for the first time, Amelia sensed the distance between what was known in this house and what had been buried beneath it. Above them, a faint echo of movement passed through the ceiling, a reminder that time was continuing whether she acted or not, and Amelia felt the pressure of that realization settle into her chest, because standing here, listening, was no longer enough. The words had already reached her, and now they were waiting for her to decide what they would become. She drew a slow breath, her posture straightening slightly as if grounding herself in something she could not fully name. And in that quiet moment between what she had been told to do and what she knew she had to do, Amelia Carter understood that this was no longer about rules or consequences. It was about whether a promise meant anything when no one else was willing to remember it. The silence between them did not feel empty anymore. It felt like a decision waiting to be made, and Amelia Carter could feel it pressing against her chest as she stood at the edge of a truth she was never supposed to carry. The man's words lingered in the air, steady and unshaken, not asking for sympathy, not asking for rescue, only asking to be remembered in a way that mattered, and that made it harder to ignore than any command ever could. Amelia lowered her gaze for a moment, not in submission, but in thought, her mind moving through everything she knew about this house, about Kang Ji-hyun, about the quiet, controlled power that shaped every corner of the estate, and none of it aligned with what she had just heard, because a man who built his life on control would not forget something like that, unless someone had made sure he did. When she looked back up, her voice was quieter, but steadier than before. If it mattered, he would already know, she said, not as a challenge, but as a truth, shaped by everything she had seen since arriving here. The man did not react immediately, but there was a shift in his expression, something subtle, something that acknowledged the reality of her words without rejecting them. "You believe that," he said, not dismissing, not agreeing, just observing, and Amelia felt a flicker of uncertainty because she did believe it, or at least she had, until now. "This house runs on information," she continued, her voice gaining a quiet clarity. "Nothing important is missed. Nothing that affects him is ignored." And as she spoke, she realized she was not just explaining the system to him. She was questioning it for the first time. The man's gaze remained fixed on hers, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a weight that made her words feel incomplete. "Then ask yourself why something like this would be missing," he said. And the simplicity of that question settled into her thoughts with unsettling precision. Amelia felt her breath catch, slightly, because there was only one answer that made sense, and it was not one she wanted to accept, not in a place where control was everything. "Someone decided it should be," she said slowly, the realization forming as she spoke it aloud. And the man gave a small nod, not triumphant, not satisfied, just confirming what she had already begun to understand. Above them, the faint sound of footsteps moved across the floor, measured and distant, but enough to remind her that time was passing, that the structure of the house continued without pause, unaware of what was unfolding below. Amelia's thoughts shifted quickly now, connecting details she had not questioned before, the way certain conversations stopped when she entered a room, the way staff avoided discussing anything beyond their immediate tasks, the way information seemed carefully filtered before it ever reached the top. She had accepted it as part of the job, part of the distance between people like her and people like him, but now it felt like something else, something deliberate. "If I say anything," she began, her voice quieter again, "it will not be seen as concern, it will be seen as interference." And she knew that was not just a possibility, it was a certainty, because in this house, people like her were not meant to carry messages, especially not ones that could shift perception. The man listened without interrupting, his posture unchanged, his presence steady. And when he spoke, his words were not persuasive, not emotional, just direct. "Then do not say it for them," he said, and Amelia felt the meaning of that settle slowly. "Say it because it is true," he added, and something in her chest tightened, not from fear, but from recognition, because that was the part she could not ignore. The truth did not depend on permission. It did not wait for approval. It existed whether it was spoken or not. And now it was in her hands. Amelia straightened slightly, her shoulders aligning as if she were preparing for something she could not fully define, her thoughts no longer scattered but focused, because the decision was no longer about whether she should be involved. It was about whether she could walk away knowing what she knew. She glanced once more toward the corridor behind her, toward the world she was expected to return to, and then back at the man whose voice had changed everything, without ever raising it. And in that quiet space, where no one else was watching and nothing demanded her action except her own conscience, Amelia Carter understood that the moment had already chosen her, and whatever came next would not be about breaking rules. It would be about whether she was willing to carry a truth that someone else had tried to bury. Amelia Carter did not say anything more, because there was nothing left to say in that room that would change what had already been set in motion. And as she stepped back from the doorway, her decision did not feel loud or dramatic. It felt quiet, settled, like something that had already taken root before she fully understood it. The man watched her without speaking, his expression unchanged, as if he already knew that whatever happened next would not happen here. It would happen upstairs in A place where words carried weight and silence carried consequences. Amelia turned and walked back down the corridor, her footsteps steady now, no longer hesitant, each step carrying her further from the place where she had been invisible and closer to a moment where she would have to be seen. The air shifted as she climbed the stairs, warmer, brighter, the polished surfaces above reflecting a world that functioned on control and certainty. And for the first time since she arrived, she saw it differently, not as something untouchable, but as something carefully constructed, something that depended on what was allowed to be known. When she reached the main level, the house was quieter than before, the evening settling into its late hours, but there was still movement, still presence. And at the far end of the hall, through a set of partially open doors, she could see Kang Ji-hyun standing near the windows of his private office, the city of Seoul. Stretching out beyond him in a field of lights that seemed endless, his figure still, composed, as if nothing in his world ever shifted without his permission. Amelia paused at the edge of the hallway, her breath measured, her hands still, because this was the moment where everything she had chosen without speaking would have to become real. She knew the rules. She knew the expectations. She knew that someone like her did not walk into that room without being called. And yet the word she. Carrie did not feel like something that could wait for permission. She moved forward slowly, each step deliberate, the soft carpet absorbing the sound beneath her feet, until she reached the doorway, the light from inside casting a faint glow across her face. For a brief second, she considered stopping, considered turning back and letting the system remain exactly as it was, but the memory of the man's voice returned again, steady and certain, and it pushed her forward in a way that fear could not pull her back. She lifted her hand and knocked once, a quiet, controlled sound that still felt louder than anything she had done since entering this house. Kang Ji-hyun did not turn immediately, and the silence that followed stretched just long enough to make her aware of every second, every breath, every possibility of what could come next. Then, slowly, he spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying the kind of authority that did not need to be raised. "You are not assigned to this floor. At this hour," he said, still facing the window, not asking, not guessing, simply stating what he already knew. Amelia felt the weight of that statement, the reminder of her place, but she did not step back. She did not apologize, because the words she carried were not hers to soften or reshape. "I need to tell you something," she said, her voice quiet but steady. And for the first time since she arrived, she did not lower her gaze. There was a brief pause, subtle but unmistakable, and then Kang Ji-hyun turned, his expression composed, his eyes sharp, assessing, as they settled on her in a way that made it clear he was not accustomed to being approached like this. The room seemed to hold its breath, the space between them charged not with conflict, but with the quiet tension of something unexpected, something that did not fit the structure he had built. Amelia stood still, her posture straight, her presence no longer trying to disappear. And in that moment, before a single word was explained, before the truth was spoken, everything had already begun to shift, because she had crossed the one line no one else in that house dared to cross. And she had done it not with power, but with the simple refusal to let something true remain unheard. The room did not react, but something within it shifted, subtle and immediate, as Kang Ji-hyun's gaze settled fully on Amelia Carter. No longer a passing glance at a servant out of place, but a focused attention that weighed presence, intent, and consequence all at once. He did not move closer, he did not raise his voice, yet the distance between them felt sharper, more defined, as if the air itself had acknowledged that this moment did not follow the usual order of things. Amelia stood her ground, her posture steady, her hands relaxed at her sides, but inside, every instinct reminded her of what she was doing, of the boundary she had crossed, and the fact that there would be no quiet way to step back now. Kang Ji-hyun tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable but precise, as if he were examining not just her words, but the reason she had chosen to speak them. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, controlled, carrying a weight that did not require volume. Then, "Speak," he said, and the simplicity of the command left no space for hesitation. Amelia drew a slow breath, not to steady fear, but to ensure that what she said would not be lost or softened, because the truth she carried did not belong to her to reshape. "There is someone downstairs," she began, her tone even, her eyes meeting his without wavering. And for a brief second, there was no reaction, no visible change, just the quiet patience of a man accustomed to hearing many things and believing very few. "He said something," she continued, and this time there was the faintest shift, almost imperceptible, a stillness within his stillness, as if the idea of a message reaching him through an unexpected path had already begun to register. Amelia did not rush, did not embellish. She simply repeated the words exactly as she had heard them. "He said to tell your son that he kept his promise." And the moment the sentence left her lips, the room seemed to tighten, not with noise, but with the absence of it. Kang Ji-hyun did not respond immediately, and for the first time since she had entered, Amelia saw something different in his expression, not confusion, not anger, but a pause that carried recognition buried too deep to surface quickly. His eyes remained on hers, but their focus had shifted inward, as if searching through something long set aside, something that did not belong to the present but refused to remain in the past. "Say it again," he said quietly, and the request was not for clarity, it was for certainty. Amelia repeated the words, exactly the same, each syllable deliberate, each pause intact, because she understood now that accuracy mattered more than explanation. When she finished, the silence that followed was heavier than before, stretching across the room in a way that made time feel suspended, and Kang Ji-hyun's gaze moved away from her for the first time, not dismissing, but retreating into thought. He turned slightly, his attention shifting toward the window, but his posture had changed, just enough to reveal that something within him had been disturbed, not visibly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Amelia remained still, her presence quiet but no longer invisible, because she had already done what she came to do. She had carried the truth from one place to another, and now it existed here, in a space where it could no longer be ignored. Behind the composed exterior of the man before her, something was unfolding, something that did not follow orders or hierarchy, something that could not be controlled in the same way as everything else in this house. And in that silence, where no one else spoke and nothing else moved, Amelia Carter understood that the words had reached their destination, and whatever they awakened next would not be hers to guide, only hers to witness as the balance between power and truth began, quietly, to shift. The silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the room with a weight that pressed against every surface, and Kang Ji-hyun remained facing the window, his reflection faint against the glass, a man who had built his life on control, now standing in a moment he had not anticipated. Amelia Carter did not move, her presence steady but quiet, because she understood that anything she said now would only interfere with something that had already begun to unfold within him. Outside, the lights of Seoul flickered across the skyline, distant and constant, a world continuing without pause, unaware that inside this room, something far more fragile than power was being uncovered. Kang Ji-hyun's hand rested lightly against the edge of the desk, his fingers still, but not relaxed, as if holding on to something unseen, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not weaker, but measured in a way that suggested he was choosing each word with care. "Who else heard this?" he asked, without turning, without raising his tone, and Amelia answered without hesitation, "No one," because that was the truth, and because anything less than truth had no place here anymore. There was a brief pause, and then he nodded once, a small movement, almost imperceptible, but deliberate, as if acknowledging not just her answer, but the weight of what she had chosen to carry alone. Slowly, he turned back toward her, his expression composed, but no longer untouched, his eyes searching. Hers not for confirmation, but for something deeper, something that could not be spoken directly. "You are certain of the words," he said, and Amelia met his gaze without wavering. "Yes," she replied, her voice steady, because she had repeated them enough times in her mind to know they would not change. Another silence followed, but this one felt different, not uncertain, but resolved, as if a decision was forming beneath the surface, not announced, not explained, but inevitable. Kang Ji-hyun moved then, not abruptly, not with urgency, but with intention, stepping away from the window and crossing the room with the same controlled presence that defined everything he did. Yet there was something altered in the pace, something quieter, less distant. He stopped a few feet from Amelia, close enough that the distance between them no longer felt like a barrier, but not so close as to impose, and for a moment he simply looked at her, not as a servant, not as an interruption, but as the person who had carried something he had not been allowed to see. "You should not have been there," he said finally, and the words could have been a reprimand, could have been a warning, but they were not delivered that way. They were delivered as a recognition of risk, of consequence, of the line she had crossed. Amelia did not respond immediately, because she understood what he was saying, but she also understood why she had not turned away, and when she spoke, her voice was quiet but firm. "He wanted it to be known," she said, not defending herself, but stating the reason that mattered. Kang Ji-hyun held her gaze for a second longer, and then something shifted, not in his expression, but in the stillness around him. A decision settling into place without announcement, without explanation. He stepped back slightly, his attention no longer divided, his focus clear, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same calm authority as before, but now it was directed with purpose. "Return to your duties," he said, and to anyone else, it would have sounded like dismissal, like a return to order, but Amelia understood that it was not the end of the moment. It was the beginning of what would follow. She nodded. Once, not out of submission, but acknowledgement, and as she turned to leave, she felt the shift in the room behind her, subtle but undeniable, like a current changing direction beneath still water. She walked out without looking back, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, but she did not need to see what came next to know that something had already been set in motion. And in the quiet that followed her departure, Kang Ji-hyun stood alone in a room that no longer felt entirely his own. Because for the first time in a long time, there was a truth inside it that he had not chosen, and it refused to remain silent. The house returned to its silence, but it was no longer the same silence that had existed before, because somewhere beneath its polished surfaces and carefully controlled routines, something unseen had shifted, and it moved quietly through every corridor, every room, like a truth that refused to stay buried. Amelia Carter continued her duties without interruption, her movements precise, her expression composed, but there was a difference now, subtle and internal, a steady awareness that what she had carried upstairs had not been dismissed, it had been received, and whatever followed would unfold without her needing to witness it directly. The night passed slowly, measured in soft footsteps and dimmed lights, until the first hint of morning began to press against the edges of the estate, a pale glow filtering through the tall windows as the city beyond stirred back to life. In the early hours, when the house was at its quietest, the kind of quiet that belonged only to transitions, Amelia found herself standing near the same corridor she had avoided before, her posture still, her breath calm, not waiting, not expecting, but aware that something had already begun to change. Footsteps approached from behind, controlled and deliberate, and when she turned slightly, she saw Kang Ji-hyun walking past her without pause, his expression composed as always, his presence unchanged on the surface. Yet there was something different in the way the space seemed to respond to him, as if the silence itself had shifted to accommodate a new understanding. He did not acknowledge her, not directly, but as he passed, there was the faintest pause, a fraction of a second where his movement slowed, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for her to understand that he had not forgotten. He continued down the corridor, toward the lower level, toward the place where truth had waited to be heard, and Amelia remained where she was, her hands still, her gaze steady, because she knew this was not her moment to follow. This was not her role to complete. Time moved forward, quiet and uninterrupted, until eventually the house resumed its full rhythm, staff moving through their routines, voices low, everything appearing exactly as it always had. And yet beneath that surface, something had been corrected, something that had once been hidden was no longer entirely out of reach. Later that morning, as Amelia carried a tray through the main hall, she passed by the office again, the door slightly open, and inside, Kang Ji-hyun stood near the window once more, the city stretching out before him. But this time, there was a subtle difference in his stillness, not in posture, not in control, but in presence, as if the weight he carried had shifted, not lighter, but more balanced. He did not turn, he did not speak, but as Amelia walked past, she felt it again, that quiet acknowledgement that did not require words, the kind that existed only when something true had been recognized and could no longer be ignored. She continued on without stopping, her steps steady, her role unchanged in appearance. But within her, something had settled, not pride, not relief, but a quiet certainty that what she had done mattered, even if no one would ever say it aloud. And somewhere within the walls of that house, beyond the reach of routine and control, a promise that had once been forgotten had found its way back to where it belonged, not through power, not through force, but through a single moment of listening that refused to remain silent. In that day, without announcement, without spectacle, the balance between power and dignity shifted just enough for the truth to be seen, even if only by those who understood what it meant to carry it.